Hello and welcome. You're listening to Horizontal Power Hour, produced by the Anarchist radio collective known as the Dream Committee. Today your hosts are Nick Petrie and Mika Taliaferro, and today's topic is the prison industrial complex and resistance to it. Whether that confuses, excites, or infuriates you, stay tuned to find out more. You're listening to WESU-Middletown 88.1, all the way to the left on your dial. We'd like to remind the listener that the views expressed on the show are our own and in no way reflect the views and opinions of Wesleyan University or the WESU management. For that matter, we don't even represent our entire collective. Each of us is our own person with our own unique perspective on the world. Now we'll hear an interview with Molly Porzik and Whitney Walton, members of the LA branch of Critical Resistance. By the way, that was Johnny Cash with Folsom Prison Blues. Here's a little tidbit from Critical Resistance website about what they do. Critical Resistance seeks to build an international movement to end the prison industrial complex by challenging the belief that caging and controlling people makes us safe. We believe that the necessities such as food, shelter, and freedom are what make our communities secure. As such, our work is part of global struggles against inequality and powerlessness. Molly, Whitney, are you with us?
Yep.
Okay, great. I guess to start, what is prison abolition, and what does it mean to do prison abolition work?
We might just back it up a second and talk about like an important distinction that we make in our work of prison industrial complex abolition versus prison abolition. And we specifically use the term prison industrial complex because more than just talking about prisons, we're actually talking about an intersection of government and industry interests that use surveillance, policing, and incarceration as methods for social control and responses and answers to social, economic, and political problems. So we're not just talking about the fact that we need to get rid of prisons, but we need to get rid of the ways that incarcerating people and punishing people are the priority in U.S. society. And so we're also talking about getting rid of the police. We're also talking about getting rid of militarization and how these methods are strategically used to maintain the status quo of authority and to perpetuate racism, white supremacy, homophobia, capitalism, and so forth. So we're talking about, when we talk about abolition, we talk about that for a lot of reasons, mostly because the prison industrial complex works exactly as it's designed to. It's not broken, and it's not something that we can reform or fix. And so we need to abolish it. And we also know that the basic necessities of food and housing and education and jobs, self-determination, community responses to violence and harm are the things that actually create healthy, sustainable, and safe communities. That kind of outlines the political ideology that guides our grassroots work. So we do both dismantling work, we do campaigns and projects that are trying to tear down the reliance on surveillance, policing, and incarceration. But we also do a lot of building work where we try to build communities up to be able to determine for themselves what's actually going to create healthy, sustainable relationships where people can respond to harm and conflict in a way that's not actually just producing more harm and violence.
I noticed you used the word harm. Could you talk about what critical resistance definition of harm is and how that might be different from violence?
Harm speaks to primarily the ways that people's bodies are impacted in ways that are not consensual. So we use words like talking about violence and harm as opposed to crime, because crime is a word that has been created by the prison industrial complex specifically to justify the locking up of millions of people in cages. There's always a geopolitical context to what is considered crime. So, for instance, you can look at different drugs that are legalized in the United States and what is considered criminal when we're talking about drug use, right? Like there are certain drugs that are considered illegal, and to use them or deal them is considered a crime, right? but then there's all kinds of legalized prescription drugs that have similar effects. I think part of the struggle is trying to be conscious of the language that we're using, and to try to create our own language. The prison industrial complex is very good at using the words we use. So one word that we use a lot is accountability, right? And trying to create models for community accountability as opposed to responding to conflict through punitive measures. But at the same time, we see the state and the prison industrial complex and the people who benefit from the prison industrial complex, specifically from locking people up, who use the word accountability all the time, right? So we hear even the police using the word accountability and talking about police accountability, when actually that's the biggest contradiction that you could talk about, right? Is that there's no way that a police force could actually be accountable to a community.
Would you talk a little bit about what are common myths about the prison industrial complex that people hold?
I think one of the biggest myths is that there is nothing else that would be able to replace it in the same way that would even replace it in a better way to make communities safer and more sustainable. A lot of people aren't familiar with different programs and organizations that are doing the kind of work to replace the prison industrial complex right now, the kind of abolitionist work to respond to harm and violence in communities without putting people in cages.
I also think that myths actually play a huge part in terms of how the prison industrial complex really asserts its control and authority in our lives, especially through media, right, and through criminalization. So all of the ways that people of color and queer people and poor people and homeless people are targeted by the prison industrial complex and criminalized to be considered deviant or delinquent or lazy, all of these stereotypes that justify mass locking up and incarceration and killing of these same communities. Another huge way that the prison industrial complex works is through the surveillance and harassment of activists and communities that are speaking against governmental policies. Projects like COINTELPRO and the Patriot Act that are incredibly violent and incredibly invasive, using telephone and human surveillance against organizations and people who are mobilizing, who are asserting their humanity.
Could you talk a little more about, I guess, the criminalization of youth?
This can go back to some of the myths about the prison industrial complex, is that young people, especially young black and brown people, are going crazy and committing crimes all over the place, and that crime is rampant, especially in these urban areas where youth of color are up to no good at any given time. And I think one of the most relevant things that I can think of right now is, for example, the gang injunction that has been established in North Oakland here, and there's another one being proposed in East Oakland. And it's these kind of tools, even though there are only a specific amount of people put on these lists, it affects entire communities and criminalizes young people of color as a whole, because it's suggesting that, there are gangs that are in these certain areas and they're doing all of these illegal things, when in reality, I think a lot of times when young people of color are being criminalized, instead of focusing on expecting folks to be up to no good and responding to that, people aren't really thinking about the basic needs that aren't being met for these young people. So instead of investing in surveilling young people and policing young people in these communities, we should more so rather be taking preventative measures and investing in these young folks and making sure that they have quality education and after-school programming and job training and access to ways to make sure that their basic needs for food access are being met, and health care, and keeping these things sustainable long term, and not so much reacting to things after they've already happened and setting young people up to fail.
And so that's what we need to be responding to, and we need to be responding exactly by the ways that Whitney just said: transforming school systems, creating after-school programs, teaching young people and sharing with young people, including young people, in learning how to create community-based responses to violence, to learn how to problem solve and resolve conflicts on their own, right, to have jobs, meaningful jobs, to have access to food and health care. But instead, the city responded by implementing a youth curfew.
You mentioned the school system. Could you talk a little bit more about the intersection of the prison system and the school system?
Mm-hmm. So one thing that's come from a lot of anti-prison work in the past, 15 or so years, we hear a lot of slogans like the school-to-prison pipeline or education, not incarceration. Lots of research has been done. There's a lot of evidence and proof that is recognized by the state and more legitimated of expertise and whatnot, that schools can be an alternative to incarceration in and of themselves. And I think that schools obviously can be a place of learning and growth, right? And that's what we need in our communities. But at the same time, schools can be really messed up. And particularly in cities, schools are heavily militarized and policed and surveilled. And so when we actually look at schools in communities of color and in low-income communities, particularly public school systems, these schools often have metal detectors and their own security forces, or they collaborate directly with the police, so even things like in-school fighting, when kids get in fights, the ways of responding to those conflicts are still what we learned from the prison industrial complex, right? A lot of teachers police kids in hallways. That's the main educational pedagogy in the United States, is that people have to be policed and surveilled in order to learn what is right and wrong. And so when we're talking about how schools can be an alternative, we actually have to do a lot of transformative work and really try to dismantle the oppressive tactics and systems that are existent in schools as well, right? So, there are a lot of curricula that is taught in school systems throughout the United States that is absolutely white supremacist and homophobic, and upholds capitalism, and is actually not teaching kids how to think at all, but instead telling people how they have to think in order to survive. And that's a very big distinction between teaching somebody how to think as opposed to what to think.
Could you give a specific example besides schools as an alternative to incarceration? I guess because this is what I get asked about a lot, specifically in cases of extreme acts of violence and sexual violence.
Absolutely. And I think one of the big challenges about this work and really trying to engage with people and persuade people that prison industrial complex abolition is worth fighting for and should be a priority is that violence, particularly sexual violence, is a very, 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 very real thing in all of our communities. There are also multiple ways that we can actually respond to those situations that do not involve policing people, surveilling people, or locking people up.
Could you give an example?
Yeah, so one example is a story called Community Response to Domestic Violence, and it's a story that's based out of some of our allies working on creating a harm-free zone in Durham, North Carolina. And in this story, this woman is talking about the abusive relationship that she has with her partner, and she, instead of, he actually was training to be a police officer. So not only has it not become part of her political beliefs and her principles to not call the police on somebody, but also she just knew that in that situation it wouldn't work, right? Because who would she be calling to stop this person from hurting her? It would be that person's friends, right, who were police officers. And so what she did is she reached out to community organizations, and they created a model for her that prioritized her needs and her wants. And the main thing that she wanted and needed was that she wanted herself and her children to be able to be safe and to remain in her home, right? And so they set up a response to what this person was doing. A bunch of her friends confronted him, told him to leave her alone. They set up a schedule where there was always a friend staying in her house. And I think that the thing about this story, and I encourage everyone to listen to it because I'm probably not giving it justice, but you really see how that interventions to violence really do include actually building community and doing things that we don't see as the equivalent of tearing something down or stopping something. So, for instance, the main intervention that they did was that people were just constantly with her. People that loved her, that weren't going to disrespect or hurt her, were just constantly with her and her kids. Everybody took on a schedule of making meals for her and her family and just filling the house with company and love. And the relationship stopped. He left her alone, right? And so it can actually really, like, our basic needs of food and shelter and self-determination and our wants and our desires being heard and valued, those are the things that actually really do keep us safe, even in situations where someone is beating you or raping you, right? And also, I think an important element or piece of that is trying to make that process as collective as possible. The way that violence works and that the prison industrial complex absolutely thrives on is creating more isolation, right? Treating people as though the specific thing that they're doing is an individual problem that they just have to stop on their own. Or they will be removed, right? So people are being treated kind of like cancer, right? Like you remove the person who's the problem and then the problem's not there anymore. When actually how we treat each other are responses to systematic problems, right? To societal problems. It's because we learn to treat each other this way. And so I think that that story really shows us that we need, as scary as it is, and for all the reasons that we don't have trust in people to come through for us, to really try to reach out to folks and to create your system of support. That's what we're talking about. And I think that also you can see on the website, it's important to prioritize the needs and the wants of the person who's the survivor or the victim, depending on how they identify. But also a system of support needs to be created for the people who are doing the harm. And I think that that's what the prison industrial complex, particularly the prison system, absolutely ignores, is that people who are, and like, let's be real, all of us have been harmed and all of us have done harm. And that distinction of perpetrator versus victim is not always so clear. And even though there are very real situations where people are being clearly victimized, the person who's victimizing that other person also has been a victim themselves. And they need to also be encouraged to create their own support systems that are collective and to really be pushed and challenged to figure out what needs and wants of theirs are not being met that is driving them to make those decisions and to do those actions.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
You're listening to WESU-Middletown 88.1, all the way to the left on your dial. We just heard from Critical Resistance. You can find out more about Critical Resistance by visiting their website at criticalresistance.org.